emphasis of who God is. And for David, when David returns from the wilderness, he begins to function as a king, and he learns something about God. He learns something about God. Every return that we have from the wilderness, it signifies that there's a change. When David came back from the wilderness, he no longer was David labeled as a rebel, but he was David labeled as a king. There's a transition. If we look at the life of Moses, when Moses returned from the wilderness, Moses wasn't some fugitive anymore. Moses was a liberator. Yeah. And even in the life of Jesus, when Jesus returned from the wilderness, he began his ministry. And so, friends, whenever we return from the wilderness, there signifies a change. Yeah. There should be a change in our attitude. There should be a change in our ministry. There should be a change in our workplace. There should be a change in everything that we do, because we've come back from a season where we've learned something about who God is, about who we are. And so for David, when he came back, he began to function as a king. There was a change in his status. There was a change in his function. He began to function as a king. And friends, if we're not changed after the wilderness, then did the wilderness really change us? If we're not changed after the wilderness, did we really embrace everything we're supposed to learn from the wilderness? Because the wilderness is designed by God to change us. The wilderness is an opportunity for God to mold us, for God to shape us, for God to align us. And if we think we've returned from the wilderness but nothing has changed, then did we really return? Because the wilderness, returning from the wilderness, signifies a change. And so my question for us is, as we exit wilderness seasons, as we transition out of wilderness seasons, what changed? What changed? For David, something changed. For Israel, for his kingdom, something changed. The greatest lesson in David's life, the greatest lesson brought the greatest change. And sometimes the greatest change isn't a change of circumstances, it isn't a change of finances, it isn't a change of relationships in the family. Sometimes the greatest change that we can have, friends, is a change of perspective. Sometimes the greatest change is the change of perspective. If we look differently, if we see with a different lens, if we observe with new eyes, sometimes that is the greatest change that the wilderness could ever yield. And so if we look at David's life, we see that David's perspective was changed. Well, you say, okay, how was David's perspective changed? Now we can go to chapter 6, okay? Chapter 6, verse 11 through 15. Now this passage is intended to contrast King Saul and King David, whereas King David was all consumed with the presence of God and his relationship with God. Saul kind of didn't want a whole lot to do with God. But here in this passage, we see that David returns the Ark of the Covenant. If you're not sure what the Ark of the Covenant is, it's basically a golden box made out of wood that held the Ten Commandments, and it signified the presence of God with the community of Israel. And so for some time, as Saul was king and as David was in the wilderness, this box was taken elsewhere. And David brings us this Ark of the Covenant, he brings it back into Jerusalem. And here, that's where we pick up in chapter 6, verse 11. Okay, it says, "And the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, 3 months. And the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household." So David realized that the Ark of the Covenant was at this guy's house, this guy Obed's house, and he realized that God was blessing him, and so David was like, hey, I want those blessings to bring the Ark of the Covenant back to my house. And we pick up in verse 12. It says, "And it was told King David, the Lord blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all the belongings to him, because the ark of God. So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed to the city of David with rejoicing.